My name is James Flynn. I'm the International President of the Global Peace Foundation. I'm very happy to be joined here today by Dr. William Parker. Dr. Parker is an expert on international security issues with expertise in Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, specializing with understanding of weapons of mass destruction and maritime issues. He is the CEO and president of the East-West Institute, based in New York, with offices in Brussels and Moscow and elsewhere in the world. Welcome, Dr. Parker.
Great to be here. Thanks a lot, Jim.
There's a whole range of issues on the peninsula that are hot topics in today's international discourse. Can you share with us a bit of a view on the challenges and opportunities here on the peninsula?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for the question. And the reality is that if you look at the nuclear issue, and I think we'd like to start with that if you don't mind, it's a major issue, not just for the peninsula, but for the globe right now. And let's look at that for a second. The world looks at it and says, if North Korea gets away with remaining as a nuclear state, the reality is that South Korea and likely Japan will go nuclear. And if that happens, then China will look at that and say, they're increasing their abilities, I'm going to have to do the same. If that happens, you now have a nuclear North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and an increasing capability in China. But then it gets worse and more complicated, as if that's not bad enough, because now the rest of the world sees North Korea that, quote, got away with it. And now what you end up having is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction throughout the Middle East and perhaps the rest of the globe. This is a major deal we're looking at right now. It's more than just the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in North Korea. And so this idea of a unified North and South Korea is a major issue to get away from a nuclear North Korea at a state that is questionable at best.
And so there has been a lot of excitement and hope in the world in 2018 as there were summits, inter-Korea summits, summits between the U.S. and DPRK. But it seems that has not led to any clear result. Can you speak to the concerns about that and perhaps ideas about the way forward?
Of course. You know, this is something the world's been working on for decades, in the United States in particular, but not just the United States, South Koreans, Japan, China, et cetera. A lot of countries have been working on this issue. And the reality is, when the Trump administration came in, they said this was one that they were going to focus on. And they took some risks and went in and did a bilateral talk with Kim Jong-un, the first of its type, and then tried to do a second one. The good news is countries are talking, and I think this is a very good news story here. You know, the Chinese and the United States are talking, the Russians are talking, North and South Korea have actually had conversations now. So I think there's a lot of good news coming out of this, but the reality is we have brought this to a point now, kind of a boiling point, if you will, where something has to be done. And so all instruments of national power are on the table, not just for the United States, but for China, for Russia, and of course for South Korea and Japan as well.
So as the parties have come to this stalemate, really, since the lack of progress at the Hanoi summit, really the most important question is, what is the way forward? We have joined together in a forum here, Global Peace Foundation with East-West Institute and some other partners, have been having important discussions over the last few days. And one proposal on the table is to take an approach which widens the lens or recalibrates and looks at the mix of issues on the peninsula in a more comprehensive way. Do you see opportunities in that? Any thoughts about how that might help move beyond the stalemate?
Well, I'm very encouraged by the opportunity that you and I have discussed and others here on working together, bringing together a series of non-government organizations to work this very serious issue. The reality is, as we look at it, there's really three steps that we're looking at. One is to look at the human rights issues and when you can resolve those in North Korea. If you can resolve those in North Korea, then you'll see the sanctions start to drop off. because the UN sanctions are not going to drop off and individual nations aren't going to drop off until you get this human rights issues fixed. Once that's fixed, then you look at the political issue of whether or not you can actually move towards a unified North and South Korea. And once that happens and you get actual unification, which by the way, I think is a long time in coming, and we need to get there. Once that happens and you have a unified Korea, then you have the last step of whether or not the weapons of mass destruction go away, or at least they're controlled by a country that is sane, a country that is capable of controlling these type of weapons, and you're not worried about the inadvertent use of those weapons.
Among the very, very hot issues currently here in Korea and in Northeast Asia is the heightened tension between Japan and the United States. Historically, at least in the last number of decades, the relationship and alliance with the U.S. and Republic of Korea and Japan has been centrally important. Could you speak to that relationship and the issues today?
Well, I think that the relationship between the United States and Japan is very strong right now. I think the relationship between Japan and Korea, there's a little bit of tension going on there right now. But the reality is both of these countries are, one, very close allies and friends of the United States, and two, have very similar interests. And when you look at this, the security of the region is at the very top of that. The economic stability of the region is at the very top of that list as well. And so while there are some complexities there and some tensions going on based on air defense zones and other issues like that, the reality is both of them, both the countries of South Korea and Japan, are in a situation where they need to work together and will continue to work together to resolve this issue of North Korea and the tensions that are in there.
Great. One more question.
Please.
Yesterday, when you spoke to the conference here, you mentioned a bit about the opportunities of the prospect of a unified Korea. So if these complex issues could be addressed, and finally the Korean Peninsula could be reunited, then what kind of opportunities do you see there in terms of the security dynamics in Northeast Asia, economic opportunities, and so on?
Well, first of all, if we look at North Korea, I think of it as a real estate deal. It's location, location, location. And the reality is between South Korea and China, you have this country. And this country happens to be very rich on resources and very poor on technology and leadership. You combine that with South Korea, which is very rich on leadership and technology, but very poor on resources writ large. That combination is amazing. You take that and combine with it the reality that you now have a flow between South Korea and China, and for that matter, Japan, South Korea, China, and the rest of the world there, and you have something really significant from the economic perspective. From the cultural perspective, I think it's important to realize that this was one peoples that are now being brought back together again with what was at one point a very arbitrary line that was drawn on a map somewhere and separated the two peoples.
I'm sorry, I said that would be the last question, but if I could just ask one more. We greatly appreciate your joining us here in Korea and recognize that East-West Institute is doing extremely important conflict prevention work around the world. Could you say a word or two about your larger work? And I think the audience would love to hear a bit about the work that you do.
Thank you very much for that question. I'll tell you, East-West Institute's been around for almost 40 years now, and we really do focus on the East and the West. So we have offices in Moscow, we have offices in Brussels. We're working very closely with the Chinese. We're working very closely in the Middle East right now. And in particular, what we do is we bring together those individuals or those countries that wouldn't normally talk, bring them together to have those conversations. We don't do most of that publicly on purpose. We keep it private. And we have these discussions to prevent conflict in the future. But we are working very closely with the Russians, with the Chinese, with various countries throughout the Middle East. And we're looking forward to continuing to work this issue in North Korea with the Global Peace Foundation.
Great. Well, Dr. Parker, thank you so much for joining us here in Korea. And also thank you for speaking to our YouTube audience today.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to be here.